All right, so in this video, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to talk about transitional tissues. So we have two tissues left for our epithelial tissue section. And so these two tissues are a little more difficult to categorize as being squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So they're a little unique. They're obviously both stratified tissues, right? So both of these are stratified, at least in appearance. So we're going to talk about that. So let's start with the transitional tissue, okay? And so the reason transitional tissue is called transitional tissue is because it can change the shape of the cells, right? It can transition from, and remember, when we're talking about the shapes of the cells, we're talking about the cells on the top, right? So these cells. So it can change the shape of those cells for different functions, all right? And so what I mean by that is that transitional tissues, their function is they allow for stretch, okay? So this tissue would be very relaxed, all right? So when it's relaxed, these cells on the top get nice and domed. They look kind of, bubbly and round. All right, but when this tissue stretches, these cells get stretched out, right, either way, and they become very, very flat and almost squamous looking in shape, okay? And that's because it's being stretched. So they allow for stretch by being able to flatten like that, okay? So that's the function of these tissues, is to be able to stretch, and where you would find them would be in the bladder, all right, and in the ureters that lead to the bladder. Okay, so allowing that urine to move through, and it stretches to accommodate that urine that's moving through. Okay, so transitional, we can't really call it squamous, even though when it's stretched, it looks squamous on the top. We can't really call it cuboidal, even though right here, when it's nice and relaxed, it kind of looks a little cuboidal. We can't name it either of those because it can change the way it looks. Okay, so transitional tissue. All right, then our last epithelial tissue is pseudostratified. All right, and so it's called pseudostratified because if you're just looking at this picture, right here, it looks stratified, but it is not actually stratified. So there are not multiple separate layers of cells because, and I'm going to write this up here, all right, all cells reach the basement membrane. Okay, all cells touch that basement membrane, and so then it's not actually stratified. Not necessarily all cells are going to reach the free surface, right? So all cells are going to touch this basement membrane down here. Not necessarily all of them are going to reach all the way up to the top, to the free surface, but they do all touch that basement membrane. And so it's not stratified. So it looks stratified, but it's not. And that's why it's called pseudostratified. All right, and these cells on top have a very look, right? Columnar look. So that's why it's typically called columnar, pseudostratified columnar. Okay, and so with the pseudostratified columnar, they're typically found most common in the respiratory tract. All right, so respiratory. So in your nasal cavity, you have this, and typically it is, as shown here, right, it is ciliated. Okay, so it has these little hairs, all right, and those are really important for its function, especially in the respiratory tract. Those hairs help to move mucus, right, so they're going to kind of, in a coordinated way, do this kind of like doing like the wave, right, at like a stadium or something like that. They're going to move mucus along, and what they're going to do is move it, like if we're talking about the nasal cavity, we're going to move it back towards the pharynx so then you can swallow it. If we're talking about in the trachea, right, and the bronchi, it's going to move it up so it can go down to the esophagus, so up and out. All right, so always moving mucus towards the digestive tract, really. Okay, so it's in the respiratory organs, except for in the actual lungs themselves, but kind of everything leading to the lungs. And then we do also see this pseudostratified in the male reproductive system. All right, so male reproductive, whoops, there we go. Okay, and so for its function, it's ciliated, so it's going to help to move the mucus, and it also has a lot of goblet cells. All right, so goblet cells. And in the respiratory tract, those goblet cells are extremely important for making mucus to trap debris and to help humidify the air. All right, so goblet cells make the mucus. And then it has the cilia that are going to move the mucus. Those are really important functions for that pseudostratified tissue. Okay. Good. So then the last thing to talk about with our epithelial kind of tissue section is glands, because glands are derived from epithelial tissues. Okay. All right. So these are from epithelial tissues. Okay. And so glands, their job is to make and secrete things. All right. And so they're going to be these kind of clusters of cells that are going to secrete things. Okay. And so these are going to be exocrine glands. So exocrine, I'll write this up here, right? So exocrine, these are going to be glands that secrete into ducts. All right. That's what we're going to be looking at now. You can also have, you're going to learn about endocrine glands. These are going to be glands that secrete into the blood. All right, so they would be very different from this. Okay, so they're going to secrete, this would be hormones typically with endocrine into the blood. Okay, so think of hormones with endocrine. And then you can have many different things with exocrine glands. From, saliva, sweat. You can have, like, your mammary glands are exocrine. Wax glands in your ears are exocrine, right? So many different kinds of secretions. Oil, right, on your skin, that's an exocrine gland secreted into a duct. Okay, so endocrine versus exocrine, we've got that. All right. And so with these are multicellular glands, right? Unlike our goblet cell, which was a single cell gland. All right, and so these multicellular glands can make their secretions in kind of three possible different ways. And so that's what we're looking at here. All right, and so how they secrete is what's going to be different. All right, so let's start on the left and work our way to the right. Okay, so on the left, we have a holocrine gland, all right? And so holocrine gland, I always remember that it is essentially secreting the whole cell, all right? So I'll write it, it's kind of off to the side here, all right? So this is the whole cell is secreted. Okay, so that cell is going to make whatever the secretion is, a lot of it, fill up the entire cell with it, and then that cell is basically just gonna break into a bunch of different pieces and be released, and then it's gonna move out those pieces through this duct to wherever the secretion is supposed to be going. Okay, so that's the holocrine gland. So an example of this is how your oil glands are. All right. And that's one reason your oil glands can very commonly get infected, right? Especially with like acne and that kind of thing, is because those oily secretions contain essentially like whole cells. And so bacteria, that's a lot of food for bacteria, right? They love that. So they're going to go in, and that's how they end up getting infected. And it's because of this method of secretion, this whole cell secretion. So that's holocrine. All right, and then we can have merocrine. And so merocrine just occurs through simple exocytosis. All right, so it doesn't kill the cell, this process. Okay, and so you can see structurally this looks a little different, right? You just have this kind of layer of cells making their secretion versus here you have multiple layers of cells. That's because you're sacrificing the cells. So you need your mitosis, your cells undergoing mitosis. You can see that happening right here, right? This one's in kind of anaphase, telophase, somewhere in there, right? So these cells are dividing and moving up, right? And then as they move up, they'll fill with their secretion, right? Their oily secretion or whatever it is. And then they sacrifice themselves here, all right, and are secreted. Okay, but we don't have to do that with our merocrine secretion because these cells are just making their secretion into these little vesicles, right? These little yellow dots, these little vesicles, and then just releasing them through exocytosis. Okay, and so example of this would be sweat. All right, so sweat is released through exocytosis. Okay, and then lastly, we can have apocrine secretion. All right, and so for this, a portion of the cell, right, and the name kind of comes from it's the apex of the cell, right, is kind of being secreted. All right, so portion, not the whole cell, is secreted. Okay, and so you can see this cell, right, it's just kind of like pinched off here, right, the whole chunk of the cell. So we just kind of pinch this part off and secrete that, and that part's going to be full of whatever the secretion is. And so an example of this would be mammary glands, right? So this is how milk is secreted. Okay. So those are our three different kinds, methods of secretion, all right? And that wraps up the epithelial part of this chapter, okay? So now we're gonna move on to connective tissues. All right, so we're not gonna get through all the connective tissues because this is our largest category of tissues. All right, so let's talk about first what all connective tissues have in common. Okay, so what are the general characteristics of a connective tissue? Okay, so first of all connective tissues, well, almost all, there's always going to be some sort of exception. That's pretty much a rule in science. All right, there'll be little exceptions, but generally, all connective tissues are vascular. All right, that means that they have blood vessels. Okay, so they have a good blood supply. We'll talk about those exceptions to this rule when we come to them. Okay, so here on our picture, you can see these blood vessels here, all right, and these little red blood cells sitting inside of them. So those are definitely blood vessels. Here would be another blood vessel here with some red blood cells. Okay, so they're vascular. All right, so then also with connective tissues, the cells are going to be scattered. So they have scattered cells, different from our epithelial tissues, which has those very tightly packed cells that are touching each other. They're going to be scattered for these connective tissues. So they don't have to be touching each other. All right, and so with these cells, depending on their function and the tissue they're located in, they can have different names. And so here's a few of the names we're going to encounter when we go through our connective tissues. So fibroblasts, these would be cells that make fiber. And we're going to talk about fibers. All right, we're going to have a lot of fibroblasts. Okay. Osteocytes, these are going to be bone cells. All right, so osteo meaning bone. And then chondrocytes, right? This is going to be for cartilage. Chondro refers to cartilage. And then we're going to have macrophages. Macrophages' jobs are going to be to phagocytize, to eat and remove debris. Okay. right, and then also we'll have mast cells, and so that's actually the kind of cell we're seeing right here. And so mast cells are full of these little dots. Those are called granules. Those granules are full of histamine. All right, so they're gonna release histamine. That's their function, is to release histamine, and that histamine will cause inflammation. All right, so these are kind of inflammatory cells, you know, to protect that tissue if there's some sort of tissue damage or something like that. Those mast cells would release their granules of histamine and cause inflammation. Okay, so these are some of the cells that we're going to see as we go through the different types of tissues, and we'll talk about them then as well. So these cells are going to be scattered. All right, they're not all tightly packed together for these connective tissues. Okay, and so then also in connective tissue, it is composed of, in addition to the scattered cells, you have matrix. Okay, and so that matrix is made by the cells, and it consists of two big parts. All right, so the matrix has the ground substance, all right, and it has fibers. Okay, so the ground substance is essentially, like in this picture, it would be kind of all the pink stuff, right? It's the surrounding fluid or whatever the substance is, okay? So that's the ground substance, kind of surrounds everything. So we can say ground substance binds everything together. All right. And the reason it says it determines the function of the cell is that ground substance can have very different consistencies depending on the type of tissue we're talking about. So the ground substance in blood, for example, would be plasma, all right? And so that would be very fluid, versus the ground substance in bone would be like the calcium phosphate part of bone that's really, really hard, all right? And so it kind of determines the function because it can have different consistencies. Okay, and so one very common component of ground substance that we'll see is hyaluronic acid. So for a classical connective tissue, right, it would have hyaluronic acid. This has, it's a consistency that's a lot like egg whites, right, raw egg whites. So it's very jelly-like, right? It's you know, not hard, right? So cells could easily move through it if they needed to, all right? But it's not completely fluid like plasma in blood. Okay, so hyaluronic acid has kind of like a gel quality to it. Okay, so that's our ground substance. And then you have fibers mixed in as well. All right, so on this picture, that would be all these. So you have these big, thick yellow fibers and these thinner blue fibers running around. Those are all protein fibers. Okay, and so a few different protein fibers we're going to see are going to be collagen fibers. All right, so that's what those big yellow ones in the picture would be. These collagen fibers are going to be very strong. All right, so if you have a tissue with a lot of collagen fibers, that's going to be a very tough, strong connective tissue. We have elastic fibers. So the word elastic probably tells you, right? They have the ability to stretch. They have elasticity. Okay, so that's going to help with the function. So you'll have some elastic connective tissues that really are able to kind of stretch and bend and be flexible. And then we have reticular fibers that kind of form a network, right? So these are networking fibers. All right. And so typically you'll see a lot of reticular fibers. There are certain lymphatic organs that have reticular fibers. They form almost like the framework, like the studs of a house for that organ, right? So they form this network of fibers that kind of makes like a mesh framework. Okay, so that's our reticular fibers. We're not going to see as many of them as we are the collagen and elastic fibers. Okay, let's dive into some specific ones. All right, so these are our major characteristics when we talk about our connective tissues. They're mostly going to be vascular. We're going to talk about what the scattered cells are that we're going to see. We're going to talk about with the matrix, what's that ground substance made of, what's its consistency like, and what protein fibers are present in that matrix. Okay, so our first type of connective tissue, this kind of whole category we're going to talk about first is called loose connective tissues. Okay, and our first one is kind of the most typical example of a connective tissue that we could learn about. It's called areolar connective tissue. Okay, and so areolar connective tissue is found always underneath epithelial tissue. So this is when we said there's always connective tissue under epithelial tissue. It's areolar we're talking about. All right, so this is always going to be under epithelial tissues. Okay, so that basement membrane is going to be attaching those epithelial cells to areolar connective tissue that's underneath. All right, and so the function of that areolar tissue is for support, because remember, epithelial tissues are avascular. These connective tissues are vascular, so it's going to provide support in the way of nutrients, right? That nutrients, oxygen, and glucose and all that stuff coming from the blood. So it's going to support those epithelial cells, and to a certain extent, some padding. All right, so kind of cushioning underneath those epithelial cells. All right, so our cells here, and you can see them kind of scattered throughout, right? So if we're looking at the actual microscope, right, we have all these cells here. All of these, the majority of these are going to be fibroblasts. All right, that's what we're going to focus on at least. You can actually see they've drawn, like this cell here to be a mast cell, right? And probably one of these would be a macrophage. But we're going to focus on fibroblasts. And so remember, the job of those fibroblasts is to make fibers. All right, so we would also have some mast cells and macrophages present. But the majority of what you're going to see is going to be these fibroblasts. All right, and so those fibroblasts, remember, their job is to make the matrix of that tissue. And so for the matrix of this tissue, the ground substance, all right, so we'll just abbreviate that, ground substance is composed of that hyaluronic acid that we talked about. All right, so the hyaluronic acid, that egg white consistency, is going to be the ground substance of this areolar tissue. All right, and then the fibers are going to be collagen and elastic fibers. All right, so you have collagen and elastic. Okay, and so you can see those in this image here, right? So these thick pink lines running through, right? And you can see them running through like the background here and here, right? That would be another collagen fiber, right? All those are collagen fibers. And then these darker purple lines are going to be elastic fibers, right? You can kind of see one here that loops around like that. Those are elastic fibers. All right, so we have collagen and elastic fibers to provide strength and some flexibility to this tissue. Okay, so that's our areolar connective tissue. All right, our next type of tissue, loose connective tissue, is adipose tissue. All right, so adipose tissue, this is fat tissue. All right, so these are just going to be fatty tissue. So think of, it'll be located, right, wherever there is fatty tissue. So underneath in the skin, right? Underneath you have the epidermis and the dermis that we'll talk about. Underneath that you have the subcutaneous tissue. It's just this layer of fat underneath your skin, right? So subcutaneous. All right, that underneath the skin tissue is going to be fat. You also have certain organs are surrounded by fat, like the kidneys have a lot of fat around them. On the heart, you can have some fat deposits around them. So some organs have fat deposits. All right, and then in some locations, like you'll learn with the digestive system, there are mesenteries in your abdominal cavity that can collect fat deposits as well. Okay, and so the function of fat is for energy storage mainly, right? So the reason we store fat is to use it for energy as kind of like a backup source of energy. Also insulation, though, from heat, right? Preventing heat loss. And so that would be one really important function with it being right under the skin would be for insulation. Okay? And so the cells in adipose tissue are called adipocytes. Right? These are the fat cells. Okay? And so when we're looking at this picture, what we actually see, right, this would be one adipocyte here. Okay? And so these adipocytes, these cells, essentially fill almost completely with fat. All right, and so I'll draw it kind of on the little diagram over here. So this cell, if we were to draw the little fat vacuole inside of it, it would essentially be like this. All right. So that's a big bubble filled with fat on the inside of the cell. And what it does is it pushes all of the cytoplasm, right, including the nucleus, off way to the edge of the cell. So the nucleus ends up on the edge of the cell. You can see that here on the microscope picture, all right, because that giant fat vacuole has just filled up the entire cell. Okay, and so when you look at this tissue on a microscope slide, at first glance, it'll just look like you have a bunch of like little bubbles, basically, right, making up the tissue. But those are actually cells. Those are the adipocytes. Okay, so the adipocytes, they're going to be what's storing the fat. All right, then they also make the matrix of that adipose tissue, which because these cells are so big, right, they're so plump and full of fat, there's not much room for matrix in this tissue, but what it consists of is very similar to that areolar tissue. There's just not as much of it because the cells take up so much space. All right, so it would be hyaluronic acid. It would contain some collagen as well as some elastic fibers. Okay, so that's adipose tissue. All right, and then we have reticular tissue. So this is going to be one of the few times we'll actually have reticular fibers. Okay, so with reticular tissue, this is going to provide, like I said, kind of that framework, right? Like the studs on a house for some organs. And so those organs would be lymph nodes, your spleen, and your bone marrow. Both use this reticular tissue. And your liver. All right, so some tissues use it as kind of like a structural framework. Okay, so the function for that would be support, right? So structure and support. All right. And so the cells in reticular tissue, these are going to be the cells that's making all of those reticular fibers. They are called reticulocytes. I like a lot of these cell names, right? They tell you, kind of already tell you what they do, right? So reticulocytes, site just always meaning cell. So reticulocyte would make a bunch of reticular cells, and it would make sense that it would be in reticular tissue. All right, it would make reticular fibers, sorry. Okay, and so then the matrix for this is going to consist of a lot of reticular fibers with ground substance, so that hyaluronic ground substance, all right, hyaluronic acid. So reticular fibers. And then the ground substance would be primarily hyaluronic acid. So in this picture you can see, right, all these little kind of orangey looking cells are all going to be reticulocytes, and then you have these kind of dark black fibers running all throughout everywhere. Those are going to be all of those reticular fibers. Okay, good. All right, so we're just going to talk about one of our dense connective tissues in this video, and then we'll pick up with the rest of them in our next video. Okay, so with dense connective tissue, everything's very, very tightly packed. That's where the name comes from, right? So if you look at this, what is actually really tightly packed in this picture is this pink, which is all fibers, right? So you have these tightly packed fibers, right? And they're all running in the same direction for this tissue, okay? And so this tissue has, we'll say, tightly packed parallel collagen fibers. All right. So that's kind of the structure of the tissue and how you can recognize it. All right. So you have, and you can see here, all right, these, and they kind of end up being a little wavy, which we're going to talk about. But the collagen fibers are all running in the same direction. That's really important. Okay, and so where they're found is these are going to be found in tendons and ligaments. Okay, and so remember, collagen provides strength, right? Structure. That's the job of collagen. So if you have a tissue like this that's just almost completely made up of collagen, all right, then you know that's going to be a really strong tissue. And the fact that this collagen is all running in the same direction, that's going to provide you strength in one direction. So that's the function. Strength in one direction. Because those collagen fibers are all running in one direction. If you think about what a tendon and a ligament does, so a tendon connects a muscle to bone, right? So if you think about your biceps muscle, right, in your upper arm, and it connects at the elbow, right, to your radius, which is your arm bone kind of on your thumb side. Okay, and so you think about that, when that muscle contracts, it's going to only really pull in one direction. So you need that tendon that's connecting the muscle to the bone to be really, really strong in one direction. Okay, so that's the function of this dense, and it's regular because everything's moving in one direction, connective tissue. All right, and so the reason, and this helps I think in lab a lot, that this tissue looks wavy usually like this, because it can look in lab very similar to smooth muscle, but smooth muscle doesn't have this wavy characteristic to it. And that's because normally when this tissue is intact, it's going to be pulled taut, right? So this will be pulled, attached to the bone, this will be attached to muscle, it'll be pulled taut, kind of like a rubber band. When you make these slides for you to look at on your microscope, usually it's going to be cut, right, on either side. And so those collagen fibers kind of recoil and they get this wave to them. So that's one way to tell you're looking at dense regular versus smooth muscle, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so found in tendons and ligaments, and it provides strength in one direction. And then the cells, it's chock full of fibers, right? So the cells we're going to be concerned with are those fibroblasts. All right, so lots of fiber-making cells to make all of those collagen fibers, make and maintain them. All right, and so then for the matrix, we're going to have obviously a lot of collagen. There are some elastic and some reticular fibers, all right, but there's going to be lots of collagen. We'll say some elastic and reticular. All right. And then it also has that hyaluronic acid it'll be squeezed in between all of those fibers and cells, right? Not a lot of space for the hyaluronic acid, but there'll be some in there. Okay. So that's our dense regular connective tissue. So we'll pick up with more dense connective tissues in our next video.